Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Andy Cahan, and I am honored to introduce our guest. It's hard to believe 6 years have passed since George Packer was here for the Unwinding, an inner history of the new America. His prismatic exploration of the lives and schemes of citizens, both ordinary and extraordinary. That book went on to win the National Book Award, and I expect a not dissimilar future awaits his latest effort, which might also have been called The Unwinding, but it focuses on the many strands of one man, our man, Richard Holbrooke, and the end of the American century, a sort of diplomatic companion piece to the previous work. The book is told with the novelistic confidence and authority of a Graham Greene and the knowing candor of a favorite uncle. Walter Isaacson writes, informed by complete access to Holbrooke's intimate diaries and letters, along with almost 250 interviews, the book overflows with the trait that was Holbrooke's saving grace, an in-your-face intellectual honesty. The result is so bracing that our man not only revitalizes, but in some ways reinvents the art of journalistic biography. George Packer's other works include the bestselling The Assassin's Gate, America in Iraq, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and Blood of the Liberals, winner of the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. He has been honored with 2 Overseas Press Club Awards for his coverage of the war in Iraq and his reporting on the Civil War in Sierra Leone. It's a pleasure to have him return to present the Amelia Gordon Memorial Lecture. Please welcome George Packer.
Thank you, Andy. I appreciate your connecting my last book to this one. I don't think any reviewer has done that, but I'll talk about it a little bit. So I'm going to start by reading a bit from the prologue of Our Man, so you can get a taste of how it sounds, and then I'll talk about the book a bit, and then we'll talk. Holbrooke? Yes, I knew him. I can't get his voice out of my head. I still hear it saying, "You haven't read that book? You really need to read it." Saying, "I feel and I hope this doesn't sound too self-satisfied, that in a very difficult situation where nobody has the answer, I at least know what the overall questions and moving parts are." Saying, "I gotta go, Hillary's on the line." That voice, calm, nasal, a trace of older New York, a sing-song cadence when he was being playful, but always doing something to you, cajoling, flattering, bullying, seducing, needling, analyzing, one-upping you, applying continuous pressure like a strong underwater current, so that by the end of a conversation, even 2 minutes on the phone, you found yourself far out from where you started, unsure how you got there, and mysteriously exhausted. He was 6'1", but seemed bigger. He had long, skinny limbs and a barrel chest and broad, square shoulder bones, on top of which sat his strangely small head, and encased within it the sleepless brain. His feet were so far from his trunk that as his body wore down and the blood stopped circulating properly, they swelled up and became marbled red and white like steak. He had special shoes made and carried extra socks in his leather attaché case, sweating through 6 pairs a day, stripping them off on long flights and draping them over his seat pocket in first class, or else cramming used socks next to the classified documents in his briefcase. He wrote his book about ending the war in Bosnia, the place in history that he always craved, though it was never enough, with his feet planted in a Brookstone shiatsu foot massager. One morning, he showed up late for a meeting in the Secretary of State's suite at the Waldorf Astoria in his stocking feet, shirt untucked and fly half-zipped, padding around the room and picking grapes off a fruit basket while Madeleine Albright's furious stare tracked his every move. During a video conference call from the UN mission in New York, his feet were propped up on a chair, while down in the White House Situation Room, their giant distortion completely filled the wall screen and so disrupted the meeting that President Clinton's national security advisor finally ordered a military aide to turn off the video feed. Holbrooke put his feet up anywhere, in the White House, on other people's desks and coffee tables, for relief and for advantage. Near the end, it seemed as if all his troubles were collecting in his feet: atrial fibrillation, marital tension, thwarted ambition, conspiring colleagues, hundreds of thousands of air miles, corrupt foreign leaders, a war that would not yield to the relentless force of his will. But at the other extreme from his feet, the ice blue eyes were on perpetual alert. Their light told you that his intelligence was always awake and working. They captured nearly everything and gave almost nothing away. Like one-way mirrors, they looked outward, not inward. I never knew anyone quicker to size up a room, an adversary, a newspaper article, a set of variables in a complex situation, even his own imminent death. The ceaseless appraising told of a manic spirit churning somewhere within the low voice and languid limbs. Once in the 1980s, he was walking down Madison Avenue when an acquaintance passed him and called out, "Hi, Dick." Holbrooke watched the man go by, then turned to his companion. I wonder what he meant by that. Yes, his curly hair never obeyed the comb, and his suit always looked rumpled, and he couldn't stay off the phone or TV, and he kept losing things. And he ate as much food as fast as he could, once slicing open the tip of his nose on a clamshell and bleeding through a pair of cloth napkins. Yes, he was in almost every way a disorderly presence, but his eyes never lost focus. So much thought, so little inwardness. He could not be alone. He might have had to think about himself. Maybe that was something he couldn't afford to do. Leslie Gelb, Holbrooke's friend of 45 years and recipient of multiple daily phone calls, would butt into a monologue and ask, "What's Obama like?" Holbrooke would give a brilliant analysis of the president. "How do you think you affect Obama?" Holbrooke had nothing to say. Where did it come from, that blind spot behind his eyes that masked his inner life? It was a great advantage over the rest of us because the propulsion from idea to action was never broken by self-scrutiny. It was also a great vulnerability, and finally, it was fatal. I can hear the voice saying, "It's your problem now, not mine." He loved speed. Franz Klammer's fearless downhill run for the gold in 1976 was a feat Holbrooke never finished admiring until you almost believed that he had been the one throwing himself into those dangerous turns at Innsbruck. He pedaled his bike straight into a swarming Saigon intersection while talking about the war to a terrified blonde journalist just arrived from Manhattan. He zipped through Paris traffic while lecturing his State Department boss on the status of the Vietnam peace talks. His Humvee careered down the dirt switchbacks of the Mount Igman Road above besieged Sarajevo, chased by the armored personnel carrier with his doomed colleagues. He loved mischief. It made him endless fun to be with and got him into unnecessary trouble. In 1967, he was standing outside Robert McNamara's office on the second floor of the Pentagon, a 26-year-old junior official hoping to catch the Secretary of Defense on his way in or out for no reason other than self-advancement. A famous colonel was waiting too, a decorated paratrooper back from Vietnam where Holbrooke had known him. Everything about the colonel was pressed and creased, his uniform shirt, his face, his pants carefully tucked into his boots and delicately bloused around the calves. He must have spent the whole morning on them. "That looks really beautiful," Holbrooke said, and he reached down and yanked a pants leg all the way out of its boot. The colonel started yelling. Holbrooke laughed. Back in the Kennedy and Johnson years, when he was elbowing his way into public life, the phrase action intellectuals was hot until Vietnam caught up with it and intellectuals got burned. But that was Holbrooke. Ideas mattered to him, but never for their own sake, only if they produced solutions to problems. The only problems worth his time were the biggest, hardest ones. 3 fiendish wars. That's what his career came down to. He was almost singular in his eagerness to keep risking it. Having solved Bosnia, he wanted Cyprus, Kosovo, Congo, the Horn of Africa, Tibet, Iran, India, Pakistan, and finally Afghanistan. Only the Middle East couldn't tempt him. As the Washington bureaucracy got more cautious, his appetite for conquests grew. Right after his death, Hillary Clinton said, "I picture him like Gulliver, tied down by Lilliputians." He loved history, so much that he wanted to make it. The phrase great man now sounds anachronistic, but as an inspiration for human striving, maybe we shouldn't throw out the whole idea. He came of age when there was still a place for it, and that place could only be filled by an American. This was just after the war, when the ruined world lay prone and open to the visionary action of figures like Atchison, Kennan, Marshall, and Harriman. They didn't just grab for land and gold like the great men of earlier empires. They built the structures of international order that would endure for 3 generations, longer than anything ever lasts, and that are only now turning to rubble. These were unsentimental, supremely self-assured, white Protestant men, privileged, you could say, born around the turn of the century, who all knew one another and knew how to get things done. They didn't take a piss without a strategy. Holbrooke revered them all and adopted a few as replacement fathers. He wanted to join them at the top, and he clawed his way up the slope of an establishment that was crumbling under his crampons. He reached the highest base camp possible, but every assault on the summit failed. He loved books about mountaineers, and in his teens he climbed the Swiss Alps. He was a romantic. He never realized that he had come too late. You will have heard that he was a monstrous egotist. It's true. It's even worse than you've heard. I'll explain as we go on. He offended countless people, and they didn't forget. And since so many of them swallowed their hurt, after he was gone, it was usually the first thing out of their mouth if his name came up, as it invariably did. How he once told a colleague, "I lost more money in the market today than you make in a year." How he bumped an elderly survivor couple from the official American bus to Auschwitz on the 50th anniversary of its liberation, added himself to the delegation alongside Elie Wiesel, and left the weeping couple to beg Polish guards to let them into the camp so they wouldn't miss the ceremony. How he lobbied for the Nobel Peace Prize. That kind of thing, all the time, as if he needed to discharge a surplus of self every few hours just to maintain his equilibrium. And the price he paid was very high. He destroyed his first marriage and his closest friendship. His defects of character cost him his dream job as Secretary of State, the position for which his strengths of character eminently qualified him. You cannot untangle these things. I used to think that if Holbrooke could just be fixed, a dose of self-restraint, a flash of inward light, he could have done anything. But that's an illusion. We are wholly ourselves. If you cut out the destructive element, you would kill the thing that made him almost great. As a member of the class of lesser beings who aspire to a good life, but not a great one, who find the very notion both daunting and distasteful, I can barely fathom the agony of that almost. Think about it. The nonstop schedule, the calculation of every dinner table, the brain that burned all day and night, and the knowledge buried so deep he might have only sensed it as a physical ache that he had come up short of his own impossible exultation. I admired him for that readiness to suffer. His life was full of pleasures, but I never envied it. I'm trying to think what to tell you now that you have me talking. There's too much to say, and it all comes crowding in at once. His ambition, his loyalty, his cruelty, his fragility, his betrayals, his wounds, his wives, his girlfriends, his sons, his lunches. By dying, he stood up 100 people, including me. He could not be alone. If you're still interested, I can tell you what I know from the beginning. I wasn't one of his close friends, but over the years I made a study of him. You ask why? Not because he was extraordinary, though he was, and might have rivaled the record of his heroes if only he and America had been in their prime together. Not because he was fascinating, though he was. And right this minute, somewhere in the world, 14 people are talking about him. But I won't relate this story for his sake. No, we want to see and feel what happened to America during Holbrooke's life. And we can see and feel more clearly by following someone who was almost great, because his quest leads us deeper down the alleyways of power than the usual famous subjects, whom he knew, all of them. And his boisterous struggling lays open more human truths than the composed annals of the great. This was what Les Gelb must have meant when he said, just after his friend's death, far better to write a novel about Richard Holbrooke than a biography, let alone an obituary. What's called the American century was really just a little more than half a century, and that was the span of Holbrooke's life. It began with the Second World War and the creative burst that followed, the United Nations, the Atlantic Alliance, containment, the free world. And it went through dizzying lows and highs until it expired the day before yesterday. The thing that brings on doom to great powers and great men, is it simple hubris or decadence and squander, a kind of inattention, loss of faith, or just the passage of years? At some point, that thing set in, and so we are talking about an age gone by. It wasn't a golden age. There was plenty of folly and wrong, but I already miss it. The best about us was inseparable from the worst. Our feeling that we could do anything gave us the Marshall Plan and Vietnam, the peace at Dayton, and the endless Afghan war. Our confidence and energy, our reach and grasp, our excess and blindness, they were not so different from Holbrooke's. He was our man. That's the reason to tell you this story. That's why I can't get his voice out of my head. Thank you. So, a few weeks after Holbrooke's death in December 2010, his widow gave me his personal papers, no strings attached, to write a book about him. So within a few days, his filing cabinets were crowding my home office. There they are. They were blocking my bookshelves. They were making it hard to open the door. Holbrooke had taken over my life. What was in those papers? Letters from Vietnam, audio diaries from Bosnia, from Afghanistan, letters to and from Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, flattering letters, angry letters to colleagues, just a ton of material from a long career. And I spent the next year or two going through them, all the while imagining Holbrooke was in the room saying, "What are you doing reading my diaries? And what the hell is taking you so long?" And what was taking me so long was that I did not know how to write this book. The book I was working on when I came into possession of the Holbrooke papers, which Andy mentioned, was called The Unwinding. It was not a conventional book of nonfiction. to tell the story of the decline of American democracy over the past few decades through the lives of half a dozen people, I turned to the structure and style of a novel, of John Dos Passos's great trilogy, USA. And some instinct told me that a book about Richard Holbrooke and the end of the American century, which you could call The Unwinding Abroad, would also need to be an unconventional book. One day I was driving on I-84 in Connecticut, and I heard a voice in my head, which doesn't happen to me much because I am not a mystical writer. I'm a very rational, practical writer. I heard a voice that said, "Holbrooke? Yes, I knew him." You recognize those as the first words of the book. I liked the sound of it. It was a voice I wanted to follow. It was exciting. It was free. It was a voice I thought that could tell the story of Holbrooke. And it gave me the idea of writing this book as a kind of novelistic biography, though everything in the book is as true as I could make it. The only invention is that voice, which is not quite my voice. It's someone older than me, wiser than me, more experienced than me, someone who somehow knew Holbrooke in a way I did not. I knew him a little bit, but I didn't go back far with him. I knew him as a journalist. I wanted the story to be told by someone who seemed to just know him in and out. If you had a fictional counterpart for this, it would maybe be Marlowe, the narrator of some of Joseph Conrad's novels like Heart of Darkness and Lord Jim. This narrator would comment. He would have brief asides. He might tell you, "Do you mind if we hurry through the early years," which is the first line of the next chapter. He would not sound like your normal, dry, detached, biographical narrator. He would have a sort of authority, but not judgmental. He would convey a sense of intimate knowledge with the subject. I had to come by that knowledge the hard way by reading all the papers in those filing cabinets and by interviewing around 250 people. But none of that would appear in the narrative. There would be no sense of any work being done. You would just feel that somehow the narrator knew this story, had been an eyewitness to the whole thing, and he was telling it to you like a yarn, like a very long yarn, as if you'd asked him a question that led to a long night of hearing the story of Holbrooke. And it seemed to me that Holbrooke himself demanded something like that. Larger than life is a cliche that does not begin to do justice to him. And I felt that the aloof stance of a biographer could not capture him. His achievements, his failings, and his abiding value as a figure in American history could only be brought to life through the eyes of someone who had seen the span of that history, which I have not, and who had a keenly personal knowledge of America's dreams and defeats and battles with itself, and who could fully evoke Holbrooke as a poignant agent of those dreams, embodying the spirit of an era. So what do I mean by larger than life? First, there was his career. He served under every Democratic president, from John F. Kennedy to Barack Obama. Hillary Clinton once told me he was the Zelig of American foreign policy. He showed up everywhere, always in the thick of the action, because that was where he belonged. His first job at the age of 22 was as a young Foreign Service officer in South Vietnam in 1963. Really as the war was beginning to heat up. He was not sitting at a desk reading cables. He was more like an aid worker, handing out bulgur wheat and building materials and working with the local self-defense militias in what proved to be a catastrophic failure known as the Strategic Hamlet Program, which was the counterinsurgency program of that moment and which was about to collapse when Holbrooke arrived. He saw immediately that we were losing the war. He was 22, he was the senior civilian in an entire province, And what he was seeing, these big helicopter gunships coming in and strafing villages and killing civilians as well as Viet Cong, the reports going from the local level to Saigon to Washington that were full of misleading, optimistic accounts and in a way were lies. He saw through all of that really remarkably clearly. And so from the very start, he knew that the war was not going well and that if we didn't change our strategy and tactics, we would lose. And meanwhile, the South Vietnamese government was about to fall in a coup d'etat. So he was doing classic counterinsurgency work. And he was at the beginning of what became a series of stages of disillusionment, which he later described in very clear detail. The first stage is you doubt the assessments. You know these reports are misleading. The second stage, you doubt the tactics. All this heavy firepower, all this American military technology is actually creating more enemies than it's killing. And he was about to enter the third stage, which was to doubt the whole strategy of pacification and of a big American military presence. It took him 4 years to doubt the war itself, because when you're in the middle of a war and when you're working for your government, psychologically it's impossible to simply lose faith all at once. It takes a long time, and in this part of the book, I describe how Holbrooke went through all those stages until finally, when he came back to the United States in 1966, he realized that we had to find a way out of Vietnam because it was tearing our own country apart. He also used his time in Vietnam to make friends with powerful people, which was something Holbrooke did very well. That's Maxwell Taylor on the left, who was the ambassador in Saigon at the time. He would play tennis with these guys. Tennis became one of Holbrooke's main tools for promoting himself. He became a tennis partner for Taylor, for William Westmoreland, and then when he got back to Washington, he played with Bobby Kennedy. And he beat them all. He was quite a good tennis player. And somehow he assumed that they would be impressed by his tennis and wouldn't resent him. He also, when he got back to Washington, went to work in the Johnson White House, again on pacification, the civilian war in Vietnam, but from the Washington side, all the while becoming more and more disillusioned until finally he got a job on the first negotiating team that actually engaged in talks with the North Vietnamese in Paris in 1968 under Averell Harriman, who was one of Holbrooke's heroes from the earlier part of the century. He was ambitious. Here he is on the phone at Foreign Policy magazine, which he edited after leaving the State Department when Nixon got elected. He once told a girlfriend that who asked him, "How do you see yourself 5 years from now?" He had just proposed marriage to her, even though he was still married to his first wife. He proposed marriage to her, and she was taken aback, and to stall for time, she said, "How do you see yourself in the next 5 years?" And he said, "I'm going to be the next Henry Kissinger." And she actually knew Henry Kissinger, and that was the end of that relationship. Holbrooke despised Kissinger, thought he was amoral, cynical, also sort of admired and envied him because Kissinger was such a brilliant strategist. And Kissinger, for his part, once called Holbrooke the most viperous man I know in this town, which is really something coming from Henry Kissinger. So at the tender age of 35, Holbrooke went back into government under Jimmy Carter, who he supported very early on, and got a great job as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, but that job put him right in the crosshairs of Carter's national security advisors, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's in the middle of this picture at the Great Wall of China. They've gone to Beijing to begin normalizing relations with the People's Republic of China, which was an enormous historic move. But there was not room for Zbigniew Brzezinski and Richard Holbrooke. And you can sort of tell who's getting the better of it. Brzezinski looks like he's just had Holbrooke for breakfast. And in fact, at one point, he pretended to have Holbrooke's head on a platter as he served breakfast to his wife at their hotel in Beijing. Holbrooke doesn't look happy because Brzezinski, who realized that Holbrooke was a threat and a rival, left him out of meetings and relegated him to the back of motorcades and in general humiliated him. And one thing I learned through the Holbrooke papers and through reading in detail his accounts of his time in government is how brutal a game it can be and how vicious the fighting gets. In some ways, those inside who are supposed to be working together are engaged in more mortal combat than the United States is with any of its foreign adversaries. In the 90s, he became Bill Clinton's Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, just in time to become the lead American negotiator trying to end the horrible war in Bosnia. Here he is talking to Zbigniew Brzezinski, to Slobodan Milosevic at Dayton, where the war's end was finally negotiated. Milosevic would drink endlessly, get drunk, sober up, get drunk again. Holbrooke would pretend to sip his plum brandy in order to stay sober, and he outsmarted and outlasted Milosevic and finally negotiated an end to a war that killed 100,000 people. After serving at the European Bureau, he became the UN ambassador and did something you probably haven't heard of, but that's actually quite an amazing achievement. The United States owed $1 billion to the UN by the time Holbrooke got there in 1999, and that was because Jesse Helms and the Republicans in Congress did not want to pay our dues. They didn't believe in the UN. Holbrooke had to convince the Republicans in Congress to release the $1 billion and convince all 198 member states of the UN to allow our dues to go down and theirs to go up in order to keep us in the UN. We were about to get kicked out. He somehow did it. That was back when a Democratic UN ambassador could go into the offices of Republican congressmen and actually change their minds and persuade them to stay involved in international affairs. It was a different age. His last go-around in government was as Barack Obama's envoy to Afghanistan. You can tell that there isn't a lot of affection between them. Obama is at 90 degrees from Holbrooke, and Joe Biden seems to be trying to kill him with a stare. And in fact, this was the miserable end of Holbrooke's career. He and Obama not only didn't connect, Obama just disliked him. He found Holbrooke long-winded, flattering, lecturing, condescending, kind of a blowhard. Holbrooke, with that quality of lack of self-awareness that I talked about in the prologue, didn't understand why he hadn't won the trust of the new president whom he admired so much, and he did everything he could to win over Obama, and he never did. Obama would leave him off presidential trips to Kabul, Afghanistan, which was Holbrooke's whole portfolio. And you can tell that Biden doesn't seem to care for him much either. They knew each other from way, way back, and they agreed about almost every issue, so of course they deeply disliked each other. Even the end of Holbrooke's life was dramatic. Oh, and by the way, the person who saved his job when Obama was about to fire him was Hillary Clinton, who was his only friend and supporter in the administration, and who loved Holbrooke, tolerated him, was not going to destroy her own career for him, but went further than anyone to keep Holbrooke in government because she thought that he was just the best, and that even though she knew Obama couldn't stand him, we needed him, she thought, and we should keep him in. The end of his life was as dramatic as the rest of it. It ended in Hillary Clinton's office, the Secretary of State's office, which he had always longed to occupy and had never attained because of his own faults, where his aorta burst in the middle of a meeting over Afghanistan, and he was rushed to the hospital, but that was the end of his life. And then there was his personal life, which was also flamboyant and maddening and mesmerizing. He wanted to swallow life whole. He had an enormous appetite for money, which he made a lot of on Wall Street and then spent profligately. For celebrities, he was a bit of a star fucker. He had a 7-year affair with Diane Sawyer, which ended badly for Holbrooke. Here he is with Hakeem Olajuwon and Dikembe Mutombo at the UN, poking the Dalai Lama with his finger while making a point, hanging out with Robert De Niro. He loved adventure. He ate too much. He saw more movies than most of us ever heard of, and he wasn't a snob about it. His favorite was There's Something About Mary. He couldn't live without women, had numerous affairs, and was the kind of sexist who's only really himself in the company of women. His life reminds me of those protagonists of the great 19th century novels, making their way up through the imperial center and trying to prevail against an adversarial world. He never made it to the top, and the main reason was himself. He seemed at times to be a kind of comic villain, but I think in the end he was more of a tragic hero. He had egotism and idealism in immense quantities. At times they were in balance and worked together, and at times they got out of whack and things went wrong for him. The egotism made some people detest him, and the idealism made other people revere him. He was one of the very rare Americans in power who truly cared about the rest of the world, cared about people who were suffering or oppressed in places that most Americans had never heard of. His lifelong passion was refugees, which is why I think if he were alive today, it would be almost unbearable for him to watch what this country is doing in closing its doors to refugees. Here he is in a refugee camp in Pakistan. He also helped Southeast Asian refugees come to this country at the end of the Vietnam War when most Americans wanted to forget about Vietnam. He was the son of Jewish refugees from Hitler and Stalin, who never gave him any consciousness of being Jewish. In fact, he didn't know he was Jewish until he was an adult and always kept it at a great distance. But I think that background gave him a lifelong passion for humanitarian causes. He was critical of the militarization of our foreign policy, which he first saw in Vietnam and which continued until Afghanistan. But he also believed that America was a force for good, and that we always had to get involved in the world's affairs, in the lead, or else nothing would ever get solved. The results were as often harmful as helpful. This is a story that begins in Vietnam and ends in Afghanistan. I'm going to skip a few pictures. He was a diplomat, but this is not primarily a book about American foreign policy. It's a portrait of an era in American life, the era when America thought of itself as a leader of the free world. And I'm just going to end with a bit of his last audio diary. He kept these microcassette tapes in which he recorded what he was doing and thinking at the end of his life. And his voice is the voice now of a man who is beginning to fail. His health is failing. He's describing, I'm sorry that the quality isn't very good, but I think you'll hear what he's saying. He's describing having just seen the revival of South Pacific at Lincoln Center. And this is what he says about it.
Monday, August 23rd, 7 a.m. Yesterday, the 22nd, Katya and I went to the final performance of the revival of South Pacific at Lincoln Center with Frank Rich and Alex Witchell and Linda Janklow. It was a fantastic afternoon in the theater, maybe the best ever. The fantastic production, which I found immensely moving. Men were crying, myself included. I tried to understand why that show had such an enormous emotional impact on us. For me, it was the combination of the beauty of the show and its music, and the capturing in that show of so many moments in American history the show itself, opening in New York and the height of New York's greatness, 1949. The theme, Americans at war in a distant land or islands in the South Pacific. The sense of loss of American optimism and our feeling that we could do anything. The contrast with today. It was very powerful. And I kept thinking of where we were today, our nation, our lack of confidence in our own ability to lead compared to where we were in 1949 when it came out, evoking an era only 5 years or 7 years earlier, when we had gone to the most distant corners of the globe and saved civilization.
I'm sorry the quality was so bad, but I thought it was worth hearing his voice as he remembers South Pacific and his youth and thinks about where things were when he was speaking, which was 2010, just 3 months before he died. So like Holbrooke, the American century combined heroic and destructive impulses, nobility and hubris, the sense that we could do anything, and the impulse to do everything. But I really understood what this book was about only on election night in 2016, when I suddenly realized that the era he embodied was over, and we were entering something new, something diminished, and I suddenly understood that what I was now writing was history. Thank you very much.
I know it would have been impossible, but if Obama could have been persuaded to back Holbrooke solidly, would we had a better outcome in Afghanistan?
That's a great question. Holbrooke wanted to talk to the enemy in Afghanistan. He thought we cannot win this war on the battlefield. He had seen the same thing in Vietnam, and he tried to tell Obama that. And he talked about Vietnam endlessly in the Situation Room, and Obama finally said, I don't want to hear it. I was born when those events were taking place, barely. Don't bore me with Vietnam. So Holbrooke had to stop talking about it, but he didn't stop thinking about it. He realized that the only way we could defeat, or not defeat, but end a war in which we were fighting a popular insurgency in a country with a corrupt government as a partner, with a failing will on the part of the American people to stay, was by negotiation. And for 2 years, he knew that, but he didn't push it very hard. And the reason was he did not have the trust of Obama. He also was being blocked by the military, by David Petraeus, by the CIA, and even by his own boss, Hillary Clinton. And he could not afford to have any daylight between him and Clinton. So he did it quietly. Toward the very end of his life, it began to get more active. And on his last minutes alive, he was talking to Hillary Clinton about the progress he was making in finding a counterpart among the Taliban. I think it's tragic that that didn't happen, because here we are 10 years later talking to the Taliban. And in those 10 years, how many Afghans, how many Americans, how many others have died? I think the Taliban wanted to talk at that point. We did not. We were surging troops, and we had this idea that while we were pounding them on the battlefield, we should not give him a way out. In fact, Holbrooke knew from Vietnam, the time to talk is when you're at maximum strength, not when you begin to leave. Now we have 8,000 or 10,000 troops left, and we have very little leverage, and now we're trying to end the war by talking. I think if it had happened 10 years ago, we could possibly, I don't know for sure, but possibly we could have found a way to end that war.
Thank you very much for your presentation. One of Richard Holbrooke's closest friends at the beginning of his career was Tony Lake. And then they had a major, serious, catastrophic falling out later.
Yeah.
Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I skipped that part of my talk. You probably saw very quickly 3 pictures of Tony Lake, young, a little older, and then a little older. Lake and Holbrooke were like Hamilton and Burr. And it's a very tortured story, and it's a big part of the book. And it has to be, because it had effects on American policy. They met in the Foreign Service class of 1962. They immediately recognized someone of talent and promise, and they gravitated to each other. They were immediately competitive with each other. They played a ton of tennis. Lake seemed to have Holbrooke's number on the tennis court. And Lake was always a step ahead. He was more to the manner born. He was from a New England WASP family. He went to Harvard, and he had the polish and the savoir-faire to rise up quickly through the ranks of the Foreign Service. Holbrooke was this rough, raw, Jewish outsider and had to claw his way up as he saw it. But they remained friends for 10 years, close friends, until a terrible betrayal, which I describe in the book, which involved Tony Lake's wife and Richard Holbrooke. And Lake tried to be a gentleman, as Lake was and is, but no one ever recovers from that. And so that began the poisoning of their friendship. And by the time they were back in government together under Clinton, both of them working on Bosnia, Lake as National Security Advisor, Holbrooke at the State Department, they hated each other. And Holbrooke's diaries from those years are full of venomous psychoanalysis of his old friend, Tony Lake. Not to be trusted, that psychoanalysis, but shows what kind of passions can drive people who are working together on issues of huge importance. And one thing I learned from this work was how human it all is, and how decisions of great importance happen impulsively almost at times without the information you need. Holbrooke once said, we have 2% of the information we need at any given moment to make a decision. So it comes down to human character. And Lake and Holbrooke were 2 very talented, strong-willed people whose friendship turned into something toxic, and it had real consequences. And you can read about it in the book.
Granted that the American century took a hit in 2016, and if we're lucky, it'll end in 2020, but at the most, probably 2024. Are you ruling out the beginning of another American century? And also, were you influenced style-wise by Edmund Morris in Dutch?
Okay, I'll take the second one first, because that's a dangerous question. So some of you may remember Dutch was a biography of Ronald Reagan, which turned into fantasy and fiction because Edmund Morris was so frustrated by the utter opaqueness of Ronald Reagan that he had to start imagining things. Every line in this book is as factual as I can make it. There is no fiction here. It is not a novel. The voice and the style have the quality of a novel. And I wanted to do that because I find that biographies sometimes get kind of boring. And I didn't want you ever to be bored while reading this book, because I felt anxiously, who's going to read this? Holbrooke's reputation is already fading. Who cares about American diplomacy in the 90s and the 80s and the 70s? I can't afford to lose readers by being boring. So I have to write this with the kind of urgent entertainment of a novel. But it's all factual. There is no Edmund Morris invention in this. And as for the American century, I mean, something new will come. I think it matters a lot whether we get a second Trump term, because 2 terms is a permanent change, in my view. 1 term may become something more like a deviation, but our allies are not going to trust us after 2 terms of Donald Trump, and our adversaries are going to feel that they have our number because he's given it to them. So. And I think the public, after Iraq and Afghanistan, doesn't have the appetite for, not only for war, but for just engagement in the world's problems, as it did in the 90s and earlier, and during the Cold War. So I think there is a change, our influence and power have declined relative to the other great powers, especially China. It'll never be the 90s again when Richard Holbrooke could walk into the Balkans and bang their heads together and end that war with no interference from Russia or anyone else. I think that is over. But who knows where history is going to go? I can't predict.
We're living through having a president with deep flaws of character, personality, and so on, and it seems like nothing good is going to come from it. You describe Holbrooke as someone with deep flaws.
Yes.
We got some really good things. We got
Yes.
some not so good things. But one of the major themes I sense is that we got missed opportunities. That is, it could have been better. We could have gotten more from this man, and he could have accomplished more. And as you were talking, I was going back over American presidents, and so often even the great ones have deep flaws. And the failed
Lyndon
ones,
Johnson is my presidential comparison to
that's
Richard
right.
Holbrooke.
So,
Yeah.
so when you think about this whole picture, do you have any general sense of the tipping point where we're likely to more benefit than lose from the flaws and the counterpart strengths of leaders?
Well, with Holbrooke, it's hard because, as I said in the prologue, I don't think you can disentangle them. It's like a motor that you try to repair one part of, and by repairing that part, you make the motor incapable of working. He needed, I think, his relentlessness, his persistence, his aggressiveness was part of what got the war in Bosnia to end, and it also was what drove his colleagues to despise him so much that they wouldn't work with him. I don't say that every great leader needs to have that character, not at all. I think a greater leader would have the self-awareness not to behave that way. In fact, Holbrooke kept missing out on Secretary of State, and one chance was in '96. He had just negotiated the end of the war in Bosnia. He was at his high water mark, and Bill Clinton was seriously considering him, and he was also considering Madeleine Albright. And he chose Albright in part because, as Clinton said to Al Gore privately, and I learned this from one of their colleagues' diaries, I don't think Holbrooke has the self-awareness to keep his relationships from becoming toxic. That was Bill Clinton analyzing Holbrooke. Yeah. I think Clinton had more self-awareness, just not self-control. Holbrooke lacked both. But Trump obviously lacks self-awareness and self-control. What he lacks entirely is what was Holbrooke's saving grace, which was he cared about other people, Holbrooke did. He cared about Pakistani refugees. He cared about the young Foreign Service officers who worked for him, and they all regarded him as the best mentor they ever had. Trump cares about nobody but himself. So there are no values to redeem the sort of animal drives that undermine these leaders.
You said in passing at the beginning that he was not involved in the Middle East at all, which I find interesting because he seemed to always want to be at sort of the white-hot center of everything.
Yes.
So can you just briefly say what that was about?
It's a really good question and a conundrum. He never explained it, but his friends told me that he looked at the Middle East and saw nothing but trouble for himself. He would alienate one constituency or another and make it impossible to rise up to the dream of becoming Secretary of State. It was just the tar baby that he did not think he could solve or benefit from. So it was a kind of cold, selfish calculation that there was nothing in it for him. And you could say that his utter lack of any sense of being Jewish meant that the Middle East had no special meaning for him. So why impale his career on that sword? Yes.
Jackie Mason incident
Ah.
make it to your book?
Yeah, how do you know that?
We're friends with Les.
Fantastic. Okay, I'll tell the story. Amazing that you know that. So in '91, Jackie Mason was on Broadway, and his friends Les and Judy Gelb had him over for dinner, and Holbrooke was there. And Mason, with his instinctual, just his nose for zeroing in on someone, said, "Are you Jewish?" And Holbrooke kind of looked around and said, yeah. And Judy Gelb, who'd known him for 25 years, nearly dropped her dinner plate because Holbrooke had never breathed a word about it. And then Mason said, he says he's Jewish, but he's the type who's been denying it his whole life. A few weeks later, Holbrooke turned 50. And this was one of the worst days of his life because he insisted that his friends throw him an elaborate party at the 21 Club. And 100 people from the glitterati of New York came, and they took turns not just roasting him, but skinning him alive. It became such an ugly affair, one after another, as if they'd all lost their minds. The smell of blood was in the water, and they just went savage. And it culminated with his best friend, Les Gelb, pretending to interview Richard Holbrooke, Gelb playing both parts. We hear that you're Jewish. No, I'm not. Oh, yes, we have good sources on this. No, I'm not. We hear that it goes back very far. Well, maybe my great-grandmother. Oh, no, we hear it's a more direct line. Okay, maybe I'm half Jewish. And then the interviewer turns to the audience and says, and that is half true. And that was Holbrooke and Jewishness. Then 2 years later, he became ambassador to Germany, and he realized that being Jewish would be an enormous advantage, and he became Jewish for the first time.
Katya Martin spent years here in Philadelphia as a broadcaster.
Yeah.
What made her trust you as opposed to anybody else who would, that she opened up all of the material to you?
Yeah, and I couldn't have written the book without that trust. There were other people who wanted it. I had written a profile of Holbrooke for The New Yorker that is not work I like to look back on because I really didn't understand what was happening with Obama. So it was much too favorable. I honestly don't know. She trusted me. She thought I would do a good job, and she likes my writing. And, you know, you'll have to ask her whether she was right to trust me or not, because this book is not, it doesn't read like an authorized biography. This is as much of the truth and as close to the truth as I could make it. And as you can sense, it's got a dark picture as well as an admirable picture. They go together. And there's a lot of details that I know were painful, not only for Katya, but for other people who were close to him to see in a book. But I had to write the truth as I saw it. So that's the book that I wrote, thanks to Katya Martin, who did give me the papers. And thanks so much for coming, and I'll...